Um, Selamat siang.
Bisa bahasa Indonesia.
Nama saya Joon. Saya lahirnya di Korea, tapi saya tinggal di Bandung waktu saya anak kecil untuk 7 tahun.
7 tahun sampai dari kelas
dari kelas 1 SD sampai SMP. And then terus saya pindah ke Jakarta. Tapi saya nggak bisa kasih presentasi ini pakai bahasa Indonesia karena if I do, kayak anak kecil ya. So please excuse me if I present the whole thing in English. If you have any questions, if I go too fast, there's plenty of time afterwards for questions, so you can feel free to ask questions. So I didn't know I was going to be talking for an hour and a half. I think the presentation is about 45 minutes or so, maybe 40 if I decide to go fast. So, which leaves a lot of room for questions, if you guys have any questions. So let me just get started. First of all, it's an honor that I was allowed to speak in front of all of you guys today. So when I first emailed ITB, I actually just emailed just to visit and look at the studios and kind of speak with some of the professors about the curriculum and the department. But Dr. Haswin gave me this opportunity to give like a short presentation, and I don't think I'm a better architect than any of you guys. Some of you may have more experience than I do. Some of you may not. Some of you may be more creative than I am. But I feel like I've experienced different things because everyone's experiences are different. So I think today is a good time for me to share what kind of experiences I had. So if you look at some of my design and you're like, oh, I could have done better, please don't raise your hand. And bear with me as I go through the presentation. I only have 4 projects to share with you because I didn't know I had an hour and a half, so I try to make it brief. But so just a little bit about myself. I grew up here, so Indonesia is my home, although I'm ethnically Korean. I went to international school education for 12 years in Indonesia, and then I went to college in 2008, and I completed my bachelor's degree from Cornell University. And then soon after, I went to Harvard University for my master's degree. So that's the academic side of things. The professional side, I interned at Seoul Fujimoto Architects and Reva Studio. Some of you may know Reva Studio in Jakarta. HWKN, Koda, Moss, CBT Architects. So these were all short internships, some 1 month, some 2 months, some 3 months. And after I graduated, I worked at Woods Bagot office in New York for a year. And currently, I'm a senior designer at MDAS Architects based in Manhattan. So as I mentioned earlier, I have 4 projects to share. And I think it would be good to share starting from my undergrad year project, and this project I'll share is my thesis project from Cornell. So do any of you know what this image is? Have you seen this image in an architectural publication before? maybe not. So this is an image by Robert Venturi. He uses this image to speak about the idea of form versus function. So the glove, as you may know, is the form is adapted to the function. The hand has a specific shape, and the glove is to provide a layer of insulation for the hand. And so, because the function is to insulate the hand, the form is melded very closely to the shape of the hand. So function determines form. Whereas this is the mitten. The mitten has it's a larger shape. The form is a lot more flexible, which allows for multiple types of functions to take place inside. So I can have very long fingers, small hand, fat fingers, whatever it may be. The mitten allows that flexibility of function. So this is how my thesis started. I didn't really like the phrase form follows function, or function determines form, and I wanted to challenge that idea and propose a middle ground between these two extremes in architecture. So after doing a lot of research, and please excuse me, it's the slides, the text is very small, but I won't go into too much detail, but I can explain each of the categories for you, so you may not have to do the reading. So after doing some research, I realized that there is a type of architecture called adaptable architecture. And this is a type of architecture where there is a transformative element, which allows the structure or the surface or the space to adapt to a certain input or output. So I broke down adaptable architecture into multiple categories, 5 here to be specific, and I looked at the different levels of adaptation a building can have for a space. So flexible architecture is when you move a wall or a partition in the middle of a gallery, for example. By pivoting that around physically, it changes the space. It allows for different types of exhibitions. It allows for a different reading of the space. So that's a very physical level. The active adaptable architecture is there's an involvement of electricity. So you press a button or you flick on a switch, and there's a pre-programmed output where the space can be transformed. Then we have the dynamic. Dynamic is very similar to active, but there's multiple inputs and multiple outputs. So for example, a dynamic display screen. You may know Alliance Arena in Munich by Herzog and de Meuron. They have pre-programmed colors for the inflated bubbles around the stadium, but the number of inputs is infinite, and then the outputs are also infinite, but it adapts to whatever the color of the teams that are playing soccer that day, or whatever event or whatever the occasion is. So that's dynamic architecture. And then interactive adaptable architecture is the introduction of a sensor. So motion sensors, pressure sensors, climate sensors, which become the input for the adaptation of architecture or the transformation of architecture. So I think my favorite example of that is the hyposurface, Aegis hyposurface. That is the second image over there. And this has a pre-programmed, it's a parametric wall that moves and undulates, and but it has this pre-programmed pattern or routine that it undergoes, but then when someone steps in front of it, there's a motion sensor, so it starts responding to someone's movement. And then the next category is intelligent and smart architecture. And this is when not only is the building able to respond to live input sensors, the building is able to think. It's able to read a pattern of behaviors, and it's able to kind of transform before there is an input. So the building takes initiative. So in my research, I wasn't able to find any intelligent/smart architecture back when I did this research, which was in 2012. But nowadays, there's more like Amazon Echo Dot or like Google Home, or there's these devices that allow for the home to be a lot smarter. But I still believe that it doesn't do justice, that it's not an architectural transformation, and that it is only, turning on a light or playing music, or so it's very limited at this moment. So what my thesis aimed to do is propose a intelligent and or smart adaptable architecture. So this is a video of a flexible system that, like a prototype that I developed to achieve this transformability. In order to have adaptable architecture, something has to move, right? So this is the moving portion. And I didn't want to use mechanical components. For example, the Wiley Theater in Dallas by OMA, I think it's in Dallas, they have this really high-tech stage that lowers and raises depending on the performance, and that's an adaptation right there. But it's very expensive, and it's also very specific to the programmed kind of inputs. So this is a pneumatic structure, inflatable structure, embedded in a flexible wooden kind of mesh, and the expansion of the pneumatic bubbles allows for a transformation that, depending on the sequence of connections, you can achieve different types of transformation. So I experimented with 3 types of transformation. This is a very linear. The previous one was linear as well. But in the vertical and horizontal, which gives different transformations. And then if we get to the last one, this is a more spontaneous expansion. So the connections are made at random. And what I did was I bought, like, if any of you guys have fish as pets, the fish tank needs like air, constant air input, because the fish need oxygen in the water. And so I bought like fish pumps and connected it to these plastic bags, pretty much, to achieve this kind of effect. So from here, I took the prototype surface and made it into a piece of structure. I turned it into a column, and this was because I believed that this transformation is able to impact the space the most if it becomes a structural element. I referred to the hypo surface earlier, but that's just a wall. It's just a surface that undulates, and the transformation is very limited. Whereas when you're looking at a structural element, it could actually impact the entire shape of the building. So that's what I was trying to achieve. And so when these columns are coupled and there's a surface that bridges the columns, you can start to form this kind of gateway or passage of circulation that can expand and contract and start responding to whatever event or program that occurs around the site. My site was in Harajuku in Tokyo. It was an empty lot in the middle of like Yoyogi Gymnasium, Meiji Shrine, Omotesando, which is like the shopping district. So there was a shopping, like commercial component, there was an athletic component, there was a cultural component, and there was a high flux of people on that site. So this adaptable pavilion was a response to the flow of people based on the function that occurred on the site. But at the same time, this could also have a live response by pressure and motion sensors to expand and contract based on unforeseen kind of pedestrian traffic. But also, this could start to manipulate. So it takes initiative and it forces people by creating tighter portals to travel in certain directions. So in conclusion, have I truly achieved that intelligent architecture? I think the answer is no. I feel that this system, to do it justice, I would do a lot of experiments with the actual inputs, the actual pedestrian flows, and really study the site, wherever the site may be in detail, to truly achieve a adaptable scenario. But as a start, as an undergrad thesis, I would like to think that this was okay. So after I graduated from Cornell, I was working briefly in New York City for 6 months before I went to grad school, and I had the opportunity to work on the MoMA PS1 Pavilion for 2013, excuse me, by CODA. CODA is founded by Caroline O'Donnell, who is a professor at Cornell University. In fact, I was in one of her studios, and she was a very close professor of mine. So during the summer, I found out that she was looking for volunteers to help with the construction of the project. I wasn't part of the design process. I can touch upon the design briefly, but I wasn't involved in the design. I was working on my grad school application, so I didn't have the time to participate. But the design of this pavilion, first of all, what stands out the most is the cladding. So if you look at a closer image of the skin, this is a very sustainable and environmentally aware surface that Caroline designed. These are skateboard cutouts. So if many of you guys skateboard, the skateboard has round edges, right? But then when you cut it out from a huge rectangular piece, you kind of throw the rectangular piece away. And at the time when this was being designed, Caroline was working with Comet Skateboards, which is based in Ithaca, where Cornell is. So she was using a very local source, and she asked Comet to donate these cutouts, which they either throw away or they burn in the winter, because Ithaca it's very cold in the winter. So she got these cutouts donated, and then she wove these cutout boards to create a scale-like pattern on the pavilion. And the pavilion itself was also locally kind of contextually appropriate. The MoMA PS1 is located in Long Island City, which is a bridge across from Manhattan. And back in the days when you took the bridge over to Long Island City, you would see all these billboards with huge steel structures holding up whatever sign is being displayed. And Long Island City was known for this. This history, because of all the development that's happening right now, it's not as evident, but Caroline's attempt was to kind of allude to this symbol of Long Island City, so it would fit with the contextual, with the context. So I was part of the construction of this. I was the construction manager. the site supervisor for cladding the entire structure. So as volunteers, it was too dangerous for us to work on the steel. Oh, and going back to the steel as well, all the steel that was used in this project was fully recycled. So it was used for another structure. It was dismantled and brought on site. So essentially the whole project was built with recycled materials. So just wanted to touch upon that. So I was supervising the cladding of this pavilion, and these prefabricated panels that were made in Cornell were shipped to New York, to Long Island City, and we were just installing this. But this was my first ever exposure to construction. In school, or at least at Cornell, a lot of the projects are all, very theoretical. What you fabricate is, the closest thing to the actual building you make is a model, which I think has a lot of value, but it still doesn't compare to building the actual structure. So this experience to me, after 4.5 years of intense kind of theoretical architecture, this was actual architecture, and I got to experience what it takes to build and materialize and I would like to think this is a great design, and what it takes to do that. And being the construction manager, I was able to interact with the contractors that were installing these panels on site, and so there was a close conversation, a trust that built between the people working to help materialize this, and that was such a valuable experience, and it was a good food for thought as I was going into grad school. So this is one project that I worked on at Harvard GSD. During my 2 years at GSD, I had the privilege of working with many talented architects as my studio professors. My first semester, I had Akim Menges, who is a professor and architect from Stuttgart. He works in exploring biomimicry and computational design, and I would say he's probably the top in that field. He makes like annual pavilions that explore new tectonics in architecture. My last semester I had Farshid Musafi, who is an ex-partner from Foreign Office of Architects, and you may know the Yokohama Port Terminal. She was the designer for that masterpiece. So once again, smart woman. I learned so much, and it was a pleasure working with her. But I believe my I guess favorite studio from my years was with Junya Ishigami, and he was a guest lecturer there for a semester, and so we partake in this type of lottery. So we kind of put our names down for whatever studio we want to choose to be in, and of course Ishigami's studio was like very full, but luckily I got into the studio, and I had the privilege of learning from him. So the studio started out with an exercise. We were given a site. We were given a title for the studio, which was Another Nature. And Ishigami-san said, make 100 models in a week. And his intent for the 100 models was that when you approach a new design idea, we have these preconceived notions, we have our habits, we have what we think looks good, and we're unable to break away from that, so we end up applying that to the site. So what Ishigami-san wanted us to do was really exhaust and empty out our minds of all the design ideas that we have, and from that we would choose what was appropriate for the site. Of course, I didn't make 100, because that was a lot. I think I made around like 50, and this is 25 of the more presentable ones. Some of them weren't very good. So after going through this exercise, we started looking more specifically at the site. My site was at Paean Park, which is in Tokyo. It's a natural reserve to the north, and then to the south, if you see like the walled-in area, this is an art museum, an art gallery. And one characteristic element of this site was not on the site, but to the west border. There's an elevated highway, which is much taller than the park. In fact, taller than most of the trees, where there's like a lot of traffic going along the highway. So to me, this was an eyesore. To me, this was a problem on the site that I wanted to address with whatever intervention that I was making. So going back to the title of the studio was titled Another Nature. So, nature can be defined as like the trees that you see outside. That's all part of nature. Water, vegetation, hills, that's all nature. But in Japanese, there's a word called shizen and then shizenteki, which is like natural, which describes the state of being natural. So I wanted to challenge, instead of, I did kind of intervene with the nature of the park, but I wanted to create a new state of being natural, as my interpretation of the studio title as Another Nature. So to the people using this park, this elevated highway is what's natural to them. They've coped with all the sound and visual pollution that comes from this man-made infrastructure, but I wanted to challenge that and mitigate that, and create a new natural state of being. So if you can see the darker patches of green on this site plan, I decided to drastically increase the elevation of the park towards the west edge and create a huge mound which came up to be taller than 15 meters, so that this would be overlooking from above the highway. So the highway would totally be gone from sight when you're inside the park. And these are some sections that look at that. You can see to the left there is the highway, and the rightmost area of the section is where the actual park is. So by mounting this up, this created 4 different conditions. One, it accentuated the natural component of the park by removing itself from the urban context, but it also created a solid wall on the urban side of the park, which I'll get to in a bit. But it created these interstitial spaces as well. So by mounting this up, you have a whole chunk of solid earth or whatever you're patching that with, and you can utilize that as a programmatic space. So here on the uppermost section, this is a cafe that overlooks out onto the park, but also onto the urban landscape. And then there's these stairs that kind of tunnels that take you up into through this heavy earthed mound out onto the park. So by doing that, it creates this kind of duality. This is an elevation that looks at the park from the inside and the outside. It creates this park, and in this elevation you can see the taller buildings above, but my intent was that as a small scale figure within that landscape, a 15-meter tall hill is what becomes the dominant element. It becomes the dominant nature as the natural state when you are in the park. Whereas when you're out on the street level, you see a 15-meter exposed concrete wall. And there's a sense of boldness to that. There's a sense of iconic kind of presence to that. And by seeing these treetops that kind of poke above the top of the concrete wall, it gives you a hint of what is on the other side. And it almost creates this fascination or attraction to what might be on the other side. So this was a physical model that I made for one of the more extreme elevational changes. And so overall, I don't know how many people design like this. I don't think I would have been able to achieve a project like this if it wasn't for Ishigami-san's studio. But so it really helped me kind of explore and challenge the studio title, Another Nature. But at the same time, it really helped me look at, how do I design and how does Ishigami-san design. And of course, I didn't want to just copy what he did. That wasn't the purpose of the studio. It was to kind of grow upon what I already knew with a lot of input from Junya Ishigami. So this was my project from grad school. So if some of you guys are bored, this is the last project, so hang in there. This is a project that I very recently completed working for MDAS Architects in New York. Actually, no, this isn't the project. This was the project 2 years before we actually started construction, because I think I wouldn't be sharing this if I designed this. Our client was Columbia University. They have two campuses. One campus is in is their main campus with the mall and the library, and then they have a medical school campus which is about 60 streets up from the main campus. And the med school development team from Columbia approached us, and our client was at a meeting for, I think he was there for another project, and he was talking with one of the contractors about this new project. And the contractor said, you should go see the king of lobbies in Manhattan, who's Dan Shannon, who's the partner for NDAS. So that's how we got the project. The project was a lobby renovation for the auditorium, which is used for lectures and theater performances in Columbia Medical Center. And what we proposed was a total demolition of the solid facade, which doesn't allow for any light to come through. We were proposing a double height space as part of the lobby, which brought in a lot of natural light and gave the space a different sense of scale. And there were two egress stairs that were that were directly inside of this solid facade. So we had to do a close egress study that allowed us to remove those stairs and find a way to egress the people on the second floor of the auditorium in a different way. And because that was successful, we were able to propose this. And the remaining kind of backside of the auditorium, we used wood to create like this fluid surface, curvilinear surface that swooped down and connected the existing structure while reflecting the form that is behind the wood. And I'll get to a section later which clarifies why this form was generated. So this is the finished product. This finished construction in September of last year. And at the nightscape of this campus, this really becomes a beacon of light. It becomes a very iconic structure that not only provides additional light to the streetscape, but it really attracts people to the space. So it gives the campus a new face. It gives the campus this new ambiance that wouldn't have been achievable if we didn't completely make the facade transparent. This is a daytime elevation. This kind of starts to expose one of the major challenges of this project. This auditorium and lobby were built in 1968. And I don't know who built this, but as you can tell, the column is not symmetrical. On one side of the building, the column spacing seems consistent. It really wasn't. And then on the other side, there's like one column that is like totally off. I think you can see the one over there that is in the middle of the glass panel. So it was a major challenge from the elevation to, give it this even spacing of mullions while addressing the existing structure. And you may be wondering why there are like these two thick white bands that are horizontal. And this is also, there were like 70 centimeter like deep beams at the storefront, which carries the load of the top floor of the auditorium at the facade. So these transfer beams could not be removed, and so we had to embrace the existing conditions. So this is the section that looks at the two spaces. We originally started with the lobby, and as I described earlier, the form of the wood actually hugs the back of the auditorium mezzanine, and there's this triangular void on the back side of the auditorium, and that's where all the mechanical equipment goes. And surprisingly, this space needed a lot of ductwork and a lot of mechanical equipment, so the form kind of worked with that. As we were designing through the lobby, our client was, I'd like to think they were very impressed, and they gave us the inside of the auditorium to do as well. So the inside of the auditorium started much later, but both projects finished construction at the same date. So this is view from the inside of the lobby. You can see that there are these kind of slanted beams that are perpendicular to the storefront, and which is the same orientation as the wood slats that come down. The wood ceiling is a very complex ceiling. Not only the form is complex because it works with these existing plan profiles of the mezzanine, but it also has integrated mechanical systems. It has light fixtures. Those long black slots that you see there are that's the air conditioning for the space, and there's sprinklers, and along the storefront, I guess this was a pretty complex assembly as well. There's in colder climates, you want to install heating by the window, so you mitigate any of the cold coming into the space. So the entire storefront at the base has a heater, and integrated with that, there's window blinds that come bottom up, all the way up 20 feet. That's about 6 meters, right? Which allows the university to completely cover up the space for private events. So that was a huge challenge to coordinate. I don't think it came out to be perfect. That's why I don't have a video here, but just so you know. We incorporated also this nice design element into the center portion of the wood wall, which was the return air grills. So this wood became really this encompassing element that really tied everything together. And then we also specified specific furniture, which worked with the design of the space. then getting to the inside of the auditorium, I apologize that I don't have the photo from before construction, but it didn't look much different from this. The ceiling was already warping, and it had dark patches, it had leaks. The wood on the far end, like all the colors are different. It's this like really bad orangish wood. So no wonder the client wanted us to completely renovate the inside of the auditorium. We brought in the language from the exterior, the slats, and applied it to the vertical surfaces. And for the ceiling was a very complex form, and I think it would have been easier to construct if we weren't coordinating with the existing structure. So the entire existing structure of the ceiling was kept intact, and we, wherever we had to drop lower, we dropped the ceiling lower to create this very futuristic form, which becomes a focal point when you enter the auditorium. Unlike the space on the outside, the auditorium lobby, the auditorium interior had inside corners, which was a very different condition. And although it was a challenge, we used this to our advantage to create very interesting corner conditions. You can see on the left side of this photo here, there's a kind of a stepping sawtooth pattern, and this really, it was completely custom. You were trying to connect two different radiuses together, but it really turned out to be a feature element of the space. So this is looking from the stage and looking back. So this project started 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago. And I worked as a junior designer for about a year on this project. And then my boss, the project manager, decided to move to a different company. So we were left with a bunch of junior designers who were working on this project. And I think the partners really gave me a gifted opportunity to take this project on. Which I think would be unheard of as someone who only has 3 years of experience in the architecture field. So the amount of work and coordination that went into this project for the construction end was immense because of the existing conditions that existed on site. And to do this, there had to be a very close relationship with the client and the contractor. And so I was up on site 2 or 3 times a week. I was up there like every day for like the past week leading up to the completion of the project. But what I took away from this project is that, and this is similar to the PS1 Pavilion, that a lot of hands go into making architecture come to reality. I feel like in school, it's just about myself or my teammates that I'm working with if it's a group project. But once the idea has left your brain and it's on paper, and it takes the additional step to actually becoming reality, it's not a self-effort. And this was a valuable lesson that I learned through the construction of this project. And what I noticed the most, as I did in MoMA PS1, was that the trust between client and contractor is very important. Often we think of architecture as a humanitarian, like you're designing for the user of the space. You're designing for your client's home. You're designing for the client, but the process of getting there's a lot of people involved as well. So I just wanted to share that with you guys today, that architecture has many facets. It has this academic facet, but it also has this professional, real stage that it undergoes for materialization. So, yeah, those are my projects. And thank you.
Thank you. Baik, terima kasih. Mr. How do you call it? Joon Hyuk or?
You can just call me Joon.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, thank you very much. Sebelumnya saya mau perkenalkan, kita ada studio instruktur Mr. Yusi. This famous architect, and interested in the green, natural kind of stuff. And then who's the other? Oh, this is another famous architect. He's a lecturer, Pak Ahmad Tadiana. Yeah, he's also a instructor in the studio. And Ibu Widi, he just come back from Netherlands. Oke, siapa yang mau bertanya ini bisa bahasa Indonesia karena beliau mengerti bahasa Indonesia, kecilnya di sini. Jadi it's up to you, can ask in English or in Indonesia. Oke, ya ada yang menarik dan most interesting for me is the first bachelor degree. I think in ITB because it's impossible to things like that because we are more practical. The student who come, the new student come in ITB, there is nothing about architecture. We have to introduce the elements of architecture, the door, the windows, ceiling, and kind of stuff. And this one is more, conceptual ideas. Ya. Jadi arsitekturnya lebih autonomous gitu ya. Kita kan kontekstual, ini autonomous. Di start dari sebagian dari struktur bangunan. Nah ini sangat menarik. Sebenarnya sangat cocok untuk ITB barangkali menurut saya. Engineering, jadi dia dari konsep fleksibilitas itu kemudian baru cari konteksnya. Di kita di S1 kita Bagot nggak pernah ke sini ya. It's interesting. Yang lain barangkali ada S2. Is it for the master degree? Is it the landscape or as architecture program?
It was just an architecture degree. So I was dealing with landscape, but I was looking at it from a very architect perspective.
Okay. Ada tanya?
I would like to ask about your experience when you joined the studio of Prof. Archimedes in JST. What the task of, or what the studio title is.
So I guess I can share. So this is the project that I worked on with Akim Menges, or worked under. He was the studio instructor for this project. The semester was called Fibrous Tectonics, and we were tasked to look at the different hierarchies that exist in natural fibers and kind of implement that on an architectural level. So from a tectonic standpoint. So we were using weaving fibers and then hardening them with resin, and that allowed us to create these very unique looking structures that were actually very rigid. Does that answer the question?
this part of the architecture?
Yeah, it was an architecture studio, and we were trying to achieve an architectural, new architectural tectonic. So as you can see here in this final model, where we were able to generate slabs and columns and ramps with this single language of fiber weaving. That and part of the studio was also using the robotic arm to weave these mandrels that we called it, but of course to program the robot to weave this within the limited span of time wasn't possible. So a lot of these were done physically by hand, but we did experiment with the robot as well. So there was a side to the studio that was computational design, digital fabrication, and looking at biomimicry or bio-inspired architecture. Sorry, I didn't want to bring that up because I didn't want to diverge from our presentation, but I thought there was no way of explaining it without showing the visuals.
Yeah, but it's one lecture.
I have a question about this project. This is the first project of your undergraduate, right?
It's my last project
This is
from
the
undergraduate
final-
degree.
final-
My first project I can't share here because it's very
So actually,
embarrassing.
so actually, where is the forms come from? The idea, the forms. So that actually there is automations, selected ones, and very flexible. So where's the form that you got in the first?
So I mentioned earlier I didn't want to look at mechanical moving parts because that is very expensive and there's limited transformation, or at the time I thought, and instead I wanted to look at something more flexible, more easily maintainable, more less energy consuming. So there was a kind of a sustainable maybe instinct to myself when I decided that I would stick to inflatable structures instead of other flexible kind of methods out there. I did look at like the hypo surface that I mentioned in the slide below. This surface right here, it has a lot of mechanical parts. Like each node that allows for the surface to move has this piston that's connected to a digital input, and it's like there's circuit boards and all of that. Not saying that this in the end would not have any electrical equipment for the data input, but I wanted to achieve this without consuming so much electricity and so much having so many mechanical moving bits. So this feels like a more fluid way of creating transformation.
So you mean that the forms is based on your experience?
Yes, I did make many iterations, many experiments of how, like what form of plastic bag would allow for best expansion integrated within this flexible system. So it was a very rigorous process that led me to this.
I want to ask about your Ishigami Studio project. Very high, the walls. Do you considering about the change of the wind to the other side of your project? Because you make a lot of very high walls, and then how about the wind change to the other?
So the studio wasn't like I didn't approach this from a environmental or sustainable approach, but when we were on the site, the wind was pretty strong, and I feel like the wind from the overpass, the elevated highway, the wind stream that came into the park through that was, I believe, greater than, I mean, of course I would have to do a careful study of the wind patterns to make this claim, but when we were deep within the park, this was not noticeable because of all the trees. It's a heavily vegetated park, so the trees act as a wind barrier. But yeah, the answer is no, that wasn't really considered as I was designing this.
I mean about, you have maybe a study when you created very high walls and then what happens to the other sides of the city, not at the other park.
So
or the wings higher or?
So thank you for asking that. I actually, so there's a clear bias on this project. I like nature a lot more than the urban city. I like Bandung more than Jakarta. We shouldn't have recorded that, but and so my focus was to really accentuate the experience in the park, and so if you think about it, because of the development of the elevated infrastructure, that came after the park. This park is a historical park that's existed for over 100 years, and this man-made structure was suddenly imposing on the park. Now what I was doing was almost turning the back to the cityscape and focusing just on the park and the natural side of it. Any other questions?
Maybe one more.
Sure.
It's more comment. It's related more with your study in Harvard. So what is the biggest, what should I say, the biggest benefit of studying in Harvard compared to other universities? Is there any particular approach that differentiates Harvard with other, from your standpoint? I already know in general, but from your standpoint.
So the education offered at Harvard for specifically architecture is very diverse. And the diversity, within the diversity, there are experts for every single kind of field or sub-field within architecture. And so I believe that it was an environment where I could pursue, you know, whatever I was interested in architecture going into school, I was able to pursue that, and the school provided all the resources for that to be possible. So I think that was a huge advantage. Also, Harvard is not only diverse from the academic curriculum they offer, but they're also diverse with the students. So there are a lot of degrees, not just architecture, there's landscape, as you may know, landscape, urban design, there's real estate, and people come from all different backgrounds. When I was starting school, there was someone who studied music and he wanted to do architecture. So this diversity within the student population is also, I think, a very interesting environment where you can learn, and it allowed me to understand where I am, and so I'm really thankful for my years at Harvard for that, for the amount of diversity, and yeah.
Ada lagi? Is there any question? It's 15
Silakan nggak dari Baru
Perhaps I have a question. I saw that your work is very diverse and very dynamic, especially for the form. And when you come up for the last project that you show us, how do you feel and how you control yourself not to be that you cannot be able to make like a dynamic form or super different compared to others?
I think over the years I think in my undergrad years and when I was doing my thesis, I had a fascination for form, but I wanted justification for the forms that I was generating. That's why I did the thesis that I did. But ever since then, I feel that the same is with most architects, and we have practicing architects here, but I feel like your design aesthetic and your design preferences or your design styles evolve and change throughout your careers. So I took it as that you see the last project as not as formally ambitious or formally but I think it is. Not just because I designed it, but because I think my current state, I appreciate much more the development of details and the constructability of things rather than formal expressiveness. So I feel like I've gone back to be more of a modernist than and I mean I'm not trying to argue that that's the right stance, but so to me I thought that curve was too formal. Let's put it there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think that, okay. Yes.
I want to ask that because you already work in several different studios, so is there any questions for your place? What kind of that we should strive for? After we graduate, I mean, and if I want to work outside the country, is there any consideration about the other country, and do you have any suggestion which country is the best for us to learn architecture?
During my years at Cornell, we had a professional development class, and for that we had Art Gensler come in. He's the founder of Gensler, and what he told us I think really rings in my heart as well. He said it's not really important where you're working, it's important that you're working. And I think when you start working somewhere, you can really and if you're not just being spoon-fed your day-to-day kind of routines, if you're actually thinking about what you're doing, wherever you are, you're going to find a place that is better. So I don't think I'm in a position to be like sharing that certain countries are better than others to work in, because like I feel like in the United States, especially in New York, it's very hard. Low pay, crazy hours, but I think that's the same everywhere. So I mean, if you want exposure to working in different countries, I don't want to be discouraging of that. I think that is definitely going to help to your professional development. But I think what's important is that you're working and that you have an idea of what you want to, or how you want to grow. I think is more important than where you're working. Now, having said that, personally, one regret that I have is that I haven't been able to work in Europe, because I have a lot of architects that I'm fascinated about in Europe, and it's very hard to do so when, like after graduating. While I was on student visa, things were a lot more flexible. So that's one thing I regret, but I like wherever you're working at, if you have a goal, and then you'll be able to kind of derive for yourself like where would be the better next job, I think. So.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that's another question. Thank you very much, Mr. Hyuk. We are happy to have you here, and we hope that the next time you're gonna pass by ITB and sharing your next experience. Thank you. There is a little, okay.